How does your brain work? How does consciousness work? And what about the unconscious parts? What are they doing? And if you knew the answers to these questions, what could you apply to AI? We're working our way through Stephen Grossberg's book, Conscious Mind Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. My goal is to create an idiot's guide to Stephen Grossberg's theory. This video is an introduction to Chapter 3, How a Brain Sees, Constructing Reality. This is the first of 2 videos. Grossberg is a famous mathematician, neuroscientist, and psychologist. He's famous for his systematic approach to building a model of the brain, of biological intelligence, and of how they map to the mind. I hope to give you a taste of his work and to share a few ideas about how one might move from traditional AI towards a more biologically inspired form of artificial intelligence. A very large percentage of your cortex is devoted to seeing. If you put your hands like this on the back of your head, most of the cortex under your hands is dedicated to vision. That's a huge percentage of your cortex. Humans are famous for having a large frontal lobe. But what about this vision area? It's huge. In Chapter 3, Grossberg proposes that the study of visual illusions can provide a window into how the brain must work. In this work, he shows that just as relativity and quantum mechanics are alien to life as we experience it, your brain is representing your life experience in a way that is very alien to what you're experiencing. Grossberg motivates this chapter with an example. You have a blind spot, but you can't see it. Your brain is making a best estimate and filling in the information so well that you really could go a lifetime without noticing. As your eyes roam a scene, you can't detect the whole. And it's not just one blind spot. There are a host of smaller blind spots caused by veins that get in the way and caused by imperfections in your retina. And there are other sources of noise. The retina is a noisy place. Because of these sources of noise, your brain must do a lot of work to fill in the blind spots, the missing data, and the other types of noise. And this is just the beginning of all the things your brain must do to take the individual pixel-like retina sensors and group the information into a form that maps into your conscious experience. What do I mean by this? Grossberg points out that your eyes and your head are moving almost all the time. Even when you think they're still jumping around in little saccades. That means the image that is projected into your retina is also jumping around. Somehow, the conscious brain circuits are filtering out all that jumping around so that the world is stationary with respect to your head. And somehow, data from the 2 eyes are mapped from 2 retina coordinate frames into a single head-centered binocular vision frame. Here's an experiment that you can try. Close one eye and try gently moving the other eye with your fingers. Notice that in this case, the world jumps because your brain doesn't have the information on how to anticipate the eye movement. This is the psychology section. If you like what psychology teaches about the mind, this is a fun section. In this section, I introduce a sampling of the breadth and depth of psychological data that motivates each incremental lumping and unlumping of a Grossbergian model. We'll use these S windows into how the brain must work. I'm going to fly through a dozen or so different images that represent different capabilities that our brain's visual system has solved. More specifically, I'm introducing the problem of recognition versus seeing, the problem of visual boundaries, the problem of surfaces, the problem of top-down versus bottom-up processing. As a central thesis of Grossberg's work, these examples are not just interesting from a psychological perspective, but they place insightful, fundamental, defining constraints on how the visual system of the brain must work. In later chapters, Grossberg shows that the concepts developed here are not unique to the visual cortex. Amazingly, the ideas developed here underscore organizing principles that are found in all cortical areas. There's a difference between seeing and recognizing. The figure on the right is an offset grading. You see the lines, you recognize that there's an edge or a boundary here, but you don't actually see the boundary. The figure on the left is called an Ehrenstein figure. It's another example of seeing versus recognizing. You see these lines, You recognize that there's a circle laid on top of the lines. In fact, if you look closely, the circle gives you the illusion that it's brighter than the background. This is called modal. There is an illusion of brightness. Compare this to the offset grading. Here there's no illusion of brightness from the offset grading. That gives us a hint that the Ehrenstein illusion is using different visual neural circuits from the offset grading. Most of the time, seeing and recognizing work so well together, so seamlessly, that you hardly recognize that they're different. In this image, what do you see and what do you recognize? Well, you see a bunch of black blobs on a white background. I see a dog. Now, if you don't see it, you might want to stop the video and find the dog. Now that you have found the dog, how does your brain lump dots together to recognize something? How does your brain define the edges? How does your brain define the surfaces? And what are the processes that group things into recognized patterns? In terms of computer vision, this is a very sophisticated problem. How does your vision know that it knows what it's seeing? Here are 4 kinesis squares. In each of these figures, you see 4 Pac-Men, but you recognize an illusionary square sitting on top of partially hidden circles. And the illusionary square seems to be just a little bit brighter than the background. Notice this isn't a 2D illusion, this is a 3D illusion, because the square appears to be in front of the circles. Now look at the figure D. Your brain tells you that the 4 lines are in front, and then a white square, and then there are 4 black circles. Now, if you know this is a 2D drawing, why do you recognize 3 dimensions? Why doesn't your brain simply see 4 Pac-Men and 4 line segments? Why does your brain tell you that there are 4 circles being covered up? There's something sophisticated going on in terms of surfaces and boundaries and relative depth of objects in a 3D world. I see these as important questions because they hint at the possibility that we are considering a problem that is deeper than vision as a sensory computation. To me, these are questions that strike at what it means to be a visual, conscious, intelligent being. Notice that because these capabilities are the water that we swim in, we take them for granted. If computational neural models can explain things like our intuitive understanding of surfaces and boundaries and depth, then, while it's certainly not a proof, it lends hope and confidence that we're on the path to explaining not just vision, but visual understanding, both biological and machine. This is a variation on the kinesis illusion. In the figure on the right, you see 4 target bullseyes, and you recognize a translucent circle. But the circle isn't there. It's an illusion. As shown in the figure on the left, your unconscious brain is building unseen edges that reach out towards each other to define a region. And your brain recognizes that there's a boundary. But if you study the figure, you don't actually see the boundary. As shown in the figure on the right, your conscious brain is filling in a captured surface region with an estimate of the appropriate brightness of the region. From an evolutionary perspective, this is a helpful illusion. It helps you recognize the most probable interpretation of what is in front and what is behind. I love this illusion. There's no blue square. It's another kinesis illusion. Here we're manipulating the colors that you see and the colors that you recognize. Your unconscious brain is building invisible boundaries. Your conscious brain is painting a color surface that fills in an invisible boundary. One lesson that you should learn from this is that there are many precepts and other experiences that we believe to be real, but actually are mentally constructed illusions that just happen to match the structure of the world very well. Another lesson that you should be aware of is that Grossberg is working towards not just an explanation of the brain's visual system, but a definition of visual consciousness. This one is called the watercolor illusion. What's causing the illusory blue regions to glow? Why do the light blue sections appear to be in front of the plain white sections? This is another fun example that shows that your color vision can be tricked into spreading color until it finds a proper boundary. This is a great example of how your unconscious visual circuits are continually making a best guess as to what is in front and what is behind. I do like these types of color illusions. I like them a lot. As I study them, I sometimes find myself asking, mechanistically, what is this mental experience of color that I have? Vision is just amazing. How could you even begin to try to model it? Here's another set of examples from Grossberg's book. How does your brain simultaneously group edges for texturing, edges for shading, and edges for object recognition? For example, look at the figure on the left. How does your brain know what to group with what? Now look at the figure on the right. Look at the edges of this picture of Einstein. Some of the edges define boundaries of his face, other edges define textures of his face, and still other edges are simply shading of his face. There's so much going on here. You see lines, you see surfaces, but you recognize faces. In addition to color, surfaces, and edges, there's a lot of work being done by the unconscious visual circuits to properly group texturing, shading, and object recognition. Look at the two vases. Why does one vase look glossy while the other looks matte? The only difference between the two pictures is that one was given a bright glowy spot. Because the vase on the left has a bright spot, the brain recognizes that the entire vase must be glossy. The white dot tricks your brain into thinking that the entire vase is brighter. Your eyes don't see the gloss or the matte. Rather, your brain recognizes that one must be glossy and one must be matte. The invisible boundaries must also define the boundaries of the glossy areas. Whenever you look at art, what does the brain see versus what does it recognize? Well, most of what you consider art entails manipulating what you see with respect to what you recognize. For example, how does the Monet painting on the left manipulate your perception of boundaries and surfaces? How does the brain fill in the missing details? What types of details does your brain expect or require? And what types of details is it happy to fill in for you? Now consider the Da Vinci painting on the right. What does the Da Vinci manipulate? How does the Da Vinci manipulate your perception of boundaries and surfaces? For example, why does your brain see the Mona Lisa as one object in front of a background? Why doesn't your brain get confused trying to separate the woman in the foreground from the background? What color lies under these two circles? I'll give you a second to consider it. Under the circle in the lower left, you probably said the color is white. And under the circle in the upper right, you probably said that the color is black. But if you reflect on what just happened in your mind, you might have recognized that there was a gnawing feeling that under the lower left circle, there was an all black plus sign. And under the upper right circle, there was an all white plus sign. What's going on in your brain? You have a lot of experience with checkerboards, and your experience with checkerboards shaped your answer. In a competition between top-down and bottom-up neural circuits, your top-down brain circuit said the object under the circle was a checkerboard, and your bottom-up brain circuit said that the object under the circle was a plus sign. What you should learn from this image is that your visual system is a learning system that is pushed and pulled by learned top-down expectations and by unconscious bottom-up primitive data grouping mechanisms. This has been a quick sampling of some of the types of data that inspired Grossberg's model of the visual systems. I've sprinted through this material fast. In this section, we have considered seeing versus recognizing, boundaries and surfaces, colors, textures, depth, figure ground separation, bottom-up learning, top-down learning. It's a really big constellation of vision features that Grossberg strives to model. What are my impressions so far? First, the advantage of a big constellation of features is that it places many simultaneous constraints on how the brain must work. This approach, if successful, is powerful. Second, Grossberg is ambitious. He's building constraints on what the link between mind and brain must look like. I know this because I've jumped ahead and I have seen where these ideas eventually lead. Grossberg is talking about more than vision. He's talking about what it means to understand vision. As I consider Grossberg's examples and questions, I see these questions as more than vision questions. Rather, they are questions that strike at what it means to be a conscious, intelligent, visual agent, biology or machine. The weird thing is that they are such an important part of the water that we swim in that it's challenging to slow down enough to even recognize that they're important. I think of it this way. There are photoreceptors in the back of your eyes that sense colors and brightness. After that, it's layer upon layers of neurons working in darkness, with rippling waves of activities moving forwards and backwards. These neurons are grouping things, and they're recognizing things and separating foreground objects from background objects and organizing boundaries and organizing surfaces and adding and adjusting coloring to surfaces. All this information is spread out in 3 dimensions in your visual cortex. There's no little person inside your brain. There is no one neuron or clump of neurons where it all converges to a point. Has there ever been a computational system discovered or described that is as distributed as the brain is? And at the end of it all, in your mind, you have this mental experience of light and color and effortless recognition of people and things, and understood groupings of things, half hidden in camouflage. It's absolutely amazing. This is the adaptive resonance section. We can also call this art. In this section, I introduce the Grossbergian models that can simulate much of the breadth and depth of the data introduced in the psychology section. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it'll take Grossberg more than a chapter or 2 to outline the models that can begin to answer the questions raised by the psychology section. In this section today, I'm building on basic neuroscience and adding concepts and vocabulary that you will need to follow Grossberg's models. Let me remind you of Grossberg's overriding goal applied to this section. How does the visual system autonomously adapt in real time to a changing world filled with events to construct your perceived reality? Let's start with streams. In the visual system, there are 2 great streams. There is a where/how stream, and there's a what stream. Grossberg models seeing as the warehouse stream, and he models recognition as the what stream. The idea is that seeing is computed by one set of brain circuits, and recognition is computed by another. The warehouse stream knows where objects are and learns how to interact with objects visually. For example, tracking moving objects or navigating with respect to objects. The what stream learns to recognize objects. In the brain, complementary streams that flow in parallel seem to be the rule, not the exception. And they are always branching and reconnecting. In fact, they branch and reconnect so prolifically that from an experimentalist point of view, with a handful of electrodes, it's challenging to show that there even are streams. Grossberg models a stream as a series of on-center, off-surround networks. If you missed my introduction on on-center, off-surround networks, you may want to go back to video 1 for a review. Each on-center, off-surround network represents a field. A field is the basic unit of information. Again, consider the challenge of the experimenter with a few electrodes. If you stick an electrode into one cell or even a few cells and watch what it's doing, you don't exactly know what's going on because the basic unit of information is the field, not the cell. Also, notice that data, the green arrows, are going in both directions. In any stream where learning is occurring, you need just as much top-down signaling as bottom-up signaling. This enables fast, stable learning and an intimate solution to the binding problem, where every compressed signal at an upper stage is tied to its underlying raw representation. This picture diagrams the warehouse stream and the what stream. The warehouse stream is dorsal on the top of the brain. The what stream is ventral on the side, headed towards the temporal lobe. You don't notice that you have 2 streams because most of the time they work together perfectly. It's only when there are issues or when one looks at carefully crafted visual illusions that you notice that there must be 2 different pathways in the brain. What happens within a stream? Well, there are a couple things. One important organizing principle is hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. Hierarchical resolution of uncertainty is a fundamental, ubiquitous organizing principle found in all cortical streams. Raw neural data, no matter where it arises from, requires hierarchical processing with feedback before it's useful. Here's some examples: noise resolution of problems, coordinate frame transformations, aperture problems, non-local normalization of data, binding problems. Let me say a little bit more about each of these examples. Noise resolution. Noise is often filtered via hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. This is unique to each stream because one stream's noise is another stream's treasure of information. There are many types of noise that can't be resolved in a single layer. For example, if there are holes in the data caused by a blind spot, a hierarchy is needed to provide the context required to fill in the missing data. Motion suggests another example of noise. Imagine you're a football player and someone is running at you. Their arms are swinging back and forth, their knees and legs are pumping up and down, and there are hands and arms in your face blocking your clear view. How does a single patch of neurons recognize that someone is running at you and that it's not just an arm swinging towards you? The answer is that it can't. This type of information can only be sorted out via hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. Coordinate frame transformations. Coordinate frame transformations are often embedded within a neural stream. For example, the image in your mind begins as light focused on the back of your retina. Every time your eyes or your head moves, the image jumps. But somehow, jumping images from two eyes are melded into a binocular vision in a head-centered coordinate frame with no jumping. Both the aperture problem and the non-local normalization problem are huge issues in all parts of the brain. The only way to address this is via a hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. Remember the solution that we talked about in video 1? The background of square A has the same brightness as the background of square B. But your brain sees an illusion. It tells you otherwise. Hierarchical resolution of uncertainty is an important part of the story to explain the way this problem is solved. The brain recognizes that there's a shadow, and because the B square is in the shadow, the true color of B must actually be brighter than A. So your unconscious brain adjusts your perceived brightness at the square. Your brain recognizes this non-local issue and renormalizes the brightness. Think of this in terms of a small patch of image information, encoded as activity in a field of neurons. This field is our old friend, the on-center off-surround network. That field of neurons doesn't know anything about what the rest of the neural fields are doing, because it lives its life looking through a straw. To put that piece of information into context requires multiple hierarchical layers. Information is aggregated at higher levels, and it's normalized, and then it's relayed back to earlier layers. Symbol binding problem. The symbol binding problem is solved via hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. Imagine a bottom-up layer that represents the raw image of an apple, and a top-down layer that represents a compressed representation of the apple. Where the two layers are interconnected, the data and its representation are bound together. Activating one layer will prime and sometimes even activate the other representation, binding the symbol, the compressed representation, and the object together. If I show you a picture of an apple, you recognize it as an apple. If I activate this compressed representation of an apple by saying, "Think of an apple," you might imagine a picture of an apple. Hierarchical resolution of uncertainty is an important part of this larger story that explains this type of symbol binding. We've talked about what happens within a stream. Now let's talk about what happens between streams. Complementary computing is a fundamental and ubiquitous organizing principle found in all areas of the cortex. Complementary computing is the sharing of information between streams. If a neural circuit is good at computing one thing, that implies that it's bad at computing other things. One neural circuit's informational treasure is another circuit's noise. Therefore, at almost every step within a stream, there are computations that can't continue until information is shared. The entire computational information system is hyper-distributed. You can see this as you stand back and consider the cortex's web of interconnections, or the functional hotspots generated by fMRIs. Every neural field can't connect to every other field. Therefore, In terms of a computation, the trick is to explain how the brain distributes all the information in a way that it gets to where it needs to be. This means at a 10,000-foot level, the brain might look like it has similar information smeared all over the place in unexpected ways. However, at the ground level, at a given step and a given stream, it looks like an elegant lock and key system. Let me give you an example in terms of surfaces and boundaries that we have already looked at. Your visual stream has a neural stream for surfaces and a neural stream for building boundaries. Grossberg calls the surface stream the feature contour system because the surface properties become the features that you see. Grossberg calls the boundary system the boundary contour system. The two systems cooperate via complementary computing. Within a feature contour system, colors and brightness flow outward until they're stopped. They attempt to fill in an entire boundary region with the same color. If a boundary is not complete, if it has a gap, then color leaks out and dissipates. If there's a gap in the boundary, then the seed color within the boundary will mix with colors outside the boundary, and the seed color cannot fill in the region with its color. Within a boundary contour system, edges reach out, looking for other edges and attempting to create closed regions. You don't consciously see these boundaries because this circuit is unconscious. However, the fascinating thing is that you do consciously recognize them. Notice that in terms of brain neurons, the thinnest line that you can see is a surface. You can only consciously see surfaces. Where you see a change in color or a change in brightness, this creates boundaries in the boundary contour system. Where you see an edge, it's like a dam that stops the flow of the color and brightness. But on the inside of the dam, on the lake side of the dam, edges strengthen the colors so that they have more energy to flow within the boundary. The feature contour system and the boundary contour system work together via both complementary computing and hierarchical resolution of uncertainty. While the boundary contour system is not consciously visible like the feature contour system is, the boundary contour system can be consciously recognized even when it's not seen. In Grossberg's models, consciously seeing is a property of visual surfaces and conscious recognition is a property of boundaries. Take the time to stop the video and look at each of these pictures. Each has a strong boundary that you can't see, but you do recognize. Grossberg writes, quote, "We recognize boundaries that we can't see in part because recognition and seeing are carried out by different parts of the brain," unquote. Notice that in terms of brain neurons, the thinnest line that you can see is a surface. You can only consciously see surfaces. Where you see a change in color or a change in brightness, this creates boundaries in the boundary contour system. Where you see an edge, it's like a dam that stops the flow of the color and brightness. But on the inside of the dam, on the lake side of the dam, edges strengthen the colors so they have more energy to flow within the boundary. The color illusions that you saw earlier were caused by leaking and filling until stopped by a boundary. Let me pull these ideas together with an example. Imagine a line. The line is input to your retina, but the retina data is noisy, and in this raw form, the line is detected as a series of broken line segments. There exists a boundary contour system that builds invisible boundaries, suggesting how things could be grouped, and there exists a feature contour system that fills in the boundaries with a best guess at what color is inside. These two systems work together and converge on a solution. Your mind sees one solid red line. You consciously see a line as a surface in the feature contour system. The amazing conclusion you should learn from this is that a simple line is not explicitly represented in your retina, but is actively constructed by your brain. Because of this, Grossberg likes to say that every line and every surface you have ever seen in your life is an illusion. This feature and boundary system remind me of a coloring book. On the left side is the feature contour system. On the right is the boundary contour system. In Grossberg's models, these boundaries and surfaces go a step farther. All vision is composed of not just boundaries, but boundary webs. For example, consider the smooth shading of these eggs. Each egg is composed of not just one boundary, but a web of boundaries. There's a strong boundary that defines the edges of each egg, and inside there's a web of boundaries that captures the tiniest change of hue and color that you can perceive. These enable all the variations of color and brightness and texture that you can see. We've talked about a lot of things, so let me summarize everything that we've learned so far in the context of this entire video series. Let me suggest that so far there are 6 important keys to understanding Grossberg's models of the brain. Number 1, the basic unit of information is a field. 2, all cortex is organized in terms of streams of on-center off-surround networks. 3, the basic unit of consciousness is a resonance between fields. 4, error detection and corrections are fundamental first-class issues. 5, hierarchical resolution of uncertainty builds network consensus. 6, complementary computing builds network consensus. We've talked about how the brain sees and constructs reality. Starting from psychological experiments that inspired Grossberg, we've been building a list of concepts. We are working towards a model of the brain that not only describes intelligence, but the mechanisms required to explain what it means to understand, and the mechanisms required to explain the easy problem of consciousness. At this point, we have many of the building blocks that we will use for modeling the easy problem of consciousness. I think the biggest concept that we're still missing is adaptive resonance theory, or ART, which was introduced in Chapter 5 of Grossberg's book. I leave you with my warm regards. Until next time, adios, my friends.